Welcome back to Creepyverse. If you are watching this alone right now, I want you to do something before we begin. I want you to look out your nearest window. Take a good long look at what is out there. The street, the yard, the alley between buildings. Whatever it is, take a look at it in the light. Because by the time these 3 stories are finished, you are not going to want to look out that window anymore. Tonight, we are going to the road. Not just any road, the road at night. The kind of road that does not appear on travel brochures or Instagram feeds. The kind that most people only ever pass through in the daylight, windows up, music on, not thinking too hard about what the landscape looks like when the sun goes down, and the last town disappears in the rearview mirror, and there is nothing in any direction but darkness and distance, and the low drone of an engine that suddenly feels very small against the size of the world. The truckers know this road better than anyone alive. They have driven it in the small hours when the rest of humanity is safely horizontal in warm beds. They have logged millions of miles through the invisible interior of this country, through deserts that glow silver under a full moon, through mountain passes that disappear into fog so thick it feels like the world has simply ended at the edge of your headlights, through stretches of Nevada and Utah and Kentucky, where the nearest human being might be 40 miles away, and the only sound is the hum of your tires and the crackle of a CB radio that no one is answering. Some of those truckers have seen things out there in the dark. Things that do not have easy explanations. Things that do not fit inside the comfortable categories of tired eyes and atmospheric disturbance, and the well-known tendency of the human mind to manufacture shapes and faces in the absence of sufficient stimulation. Tonight, 3 of those drivers are going to tell you exactly what happened to them. The first man is Frank Miller, 35 years behind the wheel of a Peterbilt, a man who does not believe in anything he cannot hold in his hands. He's going to tell you about an October night on US Route 50 in Utah, a road they call the loneliest road in America, and about a sphere of white light that hovered motionless over the center line of the highway at 10:15 in the evening, and about how the next thing he knew, it was 1:48 in the morning, and about the 200 miles his truck had traveled in the space of time that does not exist anywhere in his memory. The second man is Samuel Jones. He goes by Grizzly, 6'4", beard like a mountain man, 40 years hauling through the Appalachians. He's going to tell you about a winter night on Route 23 in eastern Kentucky when the fog came down off the hills and swallowed him whole, when his engine died without a cough or a warning on the edge of a cliff road with no guardrail, when the silence became so total and so wrong that he knew, the way animals know before a predator arrives, that something was outside his truck. He's going to tell you about the tapping on the passenger window, about the handprint that appeared on the glass from the outside, dark and oily and impossibly detailed, fingers too long and too thin to belong to anything human, and about the 4 hours of his life that vanished while that thing was outside in the fog. The third man is Carlos Ramirez. He is younger than the other 2, a modern man, a technological man, a man who trusts machines and data and the clean, predictable logic of systems. He's going to tell you about a radio transmission he picked up on a stretch of US 95 in Nevada in July of 2018. A transmission that was not meant for public ears. And about a memory that was planted inside his mind, a memory of a childhood he never lived, vivid enough to make him cry. And about the 94 minutes that were removed from his life with the clean precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. The voice on the radio told him in advance exactly how much time would be taken, and then it took exactly that much. 3 drivers, 3 roads, 3 things that should not exist. Get comfortable. Turn the lights up if you want. It will not help. This is Creepyverse, and we are going in. Story 1. The Void on Route 50. As told by Frank Miller, age 61, long-haul trucker, retired. My name is Frank Miller, and the first thing I want you to understand before I tell you a single word of what happened to me is the kind of man I am. Because the kind of man I am is the reason this story is so difficult to carry, and the reason I am telling it to you now after 20 years of mostly keeping it to myself. I am not a man who sees things that are not there. I'm not a man given to flights of imagination, or what my father used to call, with magnificent contempt, fuzzy thinking. I grew up in Bakersfield, California, the son of a mechanic and a grocery store checker. My father could tell you the compression ratio of any engine produced in America between 1955 and 1985. My mother could calculate the exact change for a complex transaction in her head before the register finished processing. These were my parents. Precision and practicality. Facts and things you could put your hands on. I inherited their disposition completely. I started driving trucks when I was 22 years old, not because I had some romantic notion about the open road and freedom and the American highway as metaphor. I started driving because a buddy of mine from high school was doing it. He was making decent money, and I needed a job that would let me pay rent without killing my soul. I got my commercial driver's license on the first attempt. Within 18 months, I was doing long-haul cross-country runs, Sacramento to Denver, Los Angeles to Chicago, St. Louis to Seattle, the whole atlas of this country laid out under my wheels. In 35 years behind the wheel, I logged well over 3 million miles. I drove through blizzards in Wyoming where the wind was a physical force trying to push my trailer sideways across the interstate. I drove through flash floods in Arizona where the water rose across the highway so fast you could watch it climb the white lines. I drove through a dust storm in West Texas in August of 1997 that turned the sky the color of a wound and reduced visibility to about 15 feet for the better part of 2 hours. I had a blout at highway speed outside of Albuquerque in 2001 that required every ounce of skill I had accumulated to bring the rig to a stop without rolling it. I had an engine fire on a mountain pass in Colorado in the winter of 2005 that I handled with a fire extinguisher and exactly 11 seconds of controlled panic before the training kicked in and I knew what to do. I have seen every kind of strange thing the road can produce. Mirages in the desert, ghost images from extreme exhaustion, the kind of road hypnosis that makes the last 40 miles of a run feel like they happened to someone else. I know what a tired mind does to a landscape. I know how darkness shapes the imagination. I know that the human brain is a pattern recognition machine that will manufacture a face in a cloud or a figure in a shadow if you give it enough hours without proper rest and enough empty horizon to project on. I know all of that, and none of it explains what happened to me on US Route 50 in Utah in the autumn of 2003. None of it. The job was a high-priority haul. Medical equipment, the sensitive kind, imaging machinery and diagnostic tools from a supplier in Sacramento, California, to a hospital in Denver, Colorado. The receiving department had a delivery window. The dispatcher had called me twice before I left the yard to confirm I understood the timeline. This was not a load you delivered late. I left Sacramento in the early afternoon of a Wednesday in October. The sky above the Sierra Nevada was a hard, cold blue, the kind you only get in autumn when the air has thinned out and you can see for what feels like 100 miles in every direction. I crossed into Nevada as the sun began its descent, the highway cutting through the high desert with the kind of ruler-straight indifference that Nevada specializes in. I fueled up in Ely. I ate a sandwich I had packed in the cab. I got back on the road. I chose Route 50 through Nevada and Utah because it was direct and because I knew it. I had driven it before. 3 times, maybe 4. Enough to know its personality, which is to say enough to know that it barely has one. Route 50 through the Great Basin is not a road that offers you anything. There are no distractions, no scenic overlooks, no charming small towns that make you want to pull over and take a photograph. There is the road. There is the desert. There is the sky. And there is the specific quality of emptiness that exists in the high desert of the American West that is unlike any other emptiness on this continent. It is not the emptiness of a field or a plain. It is not the emptiness of open water. It is a vertical emptiness. A sky so large above you and a landscape so flat and vast around you that the mathematics of your own smallness become impossible to ignore. Life magazine called it the loneliest road in America in 1986. They were not being romantic. They were reporting facts. I crossed from Nevada into Utah just as the sun touched the western horizon, and the sky did what the desert sky does at that moment in October. It became a masterpiece of color that feels almost aggressive in its beauty. Deep orange at the horizon, bleeding upward through amber, and then into a purple so rich it was almost violet, and above that a blue so deep and dark it was already beginning to be night. The mountains to the east were silhouettes, black and jagged and ancient. The sagebrush on either side of the road had lost all its individual color and become a single dark mass, a texture rather than a landscape. I put the radio on, a country station out of Salt Lake City, the signal already showing its age, fading in and out as the terrain did what terrain does to radio waves. I poured myself a cup from my thermos black coffee that I had made strong enough to be medicinal. I had a bag of sunflower seeds on the passenger seat. I had 400 and some miles between me and Denver, and I was on schedule with a little room to spare, and the night ahead of me was the only thing in the world that needed my attention. By 10 o'clock, I was deep into Utah, and I had not seen another vehicle in over 90 minutes. The last sign of civilization had been a gas station I passed without slowing. It had not been a functioning gas station in a long time. The pumps were the old kind, tall and narrow with round dials, and they had been left to rust into the color of dried blood. The building beside them was a small cinder block box with windows that had been dark for decades and a hand-painted sign on the wall that advertised something I could not quite read. Maybe a brand of oil, maybe a price for fuel. Whatever it had been advertising was irrelevant. Whatever had stood at that station was gone. The desert had been working on it patiently and would finish the job in its own time. I passed it and drove on. The moon was nearly full, and it hung over the eastern horizon with an authority that was almost aggressive, casting the desert in a silver-blue light that drained every color from the landscape and left only value, light and dark, and the long, thin shadows of occasional rock formations cutting at angles across the pale ground. The road in front of me was a silver-gray ribbon, the white lines flashing rhythmically in my headlights, one after the other, the most hypnotic and relentless pattern in the world. My gauges were all nominal, engine temp right where I wanted it, oil pressure solid, fuel adequate for the distance. My load was secure. The truck was running with the smooth authority of a well-maintained machine in its element. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. I want you to understand how completely and deliberately normal it was, because what happened next did not announce itself. It did not build slowly from something almost strange to something undeniably wrong. It arrived the way a power outage arrives. One moment the world is functioning exactly as physics requires it to function, and then, without any warning or any reasonable explanation, it is not. The country music did not fade out. It did not thin and distort and slowly dissolve into the background hiss of a signal going weak the way a distant station should. One moment, a steel guitar was articulating a kind of longing that only steel guitars can manage, and then the moment after that there was nothing but noise. Not quiet noise, not the gentle hiss of an empty frequency. What came from my speakers was something I can only describe as aggressive. It was loud and textured and physical, a wall of static that had density to it, a quality of presence that ordinary radio interference does not have. It sounded like 1,000 insects buzzing inside the speaker cones. It sounded like the radio itself was alive and frightened and expressing that fright in the only language available to it. I turned the volume down reflexively and then reached for the tuning dial. I scanned. I'm to FM and back. Every frequency I touched, every number on the dial gave me the same thing. The same dense, aggressive, layered static. Not the usual flatness of an empty channel. The same sound. Like it was following the dial. Like it was in the air around me and the radio was just the device translating it. I tried the weather band. Static. I tried frequencies I knew to be dead in this part of the country, numbers with nothing broadcasting on them for 100 miles. Same static. I turned the radio off. The silence that replaced it was enormous. The only sound in the cab was the low drone of the diesel engine and the hum of my tires on the pavement, and those sounds, familiar and reassuring as they were, suddenly seemed inadequate. Too small, too thin. They did not fill the space the radio had occupied. I told myself it was atmospheric interference. The desert does strange things to radio waves. There are iron layers and temperature inversions, and I do not know all the science, but I know that weird radio behavior in the middle of the desert at night is not unheard of. I believed this explanation for approximately 90 seconds. Then I noticed the second thing. The air in the cab had changed. I cannot tell you exactly when it changed, because the change was gradual enough that I had been sitting inside it for some time before I consciously recognized what was different. The air felt heavy. That is the most accurate word I have. Dense. As if the atmospheric pressure inside the sealed cab had increased slightly. And there was a sound. Or not quite a sound. It was below the threshold of what I would normally call sound. It was a vibration, a frequency so low it was felt rather than heard. I could feel it in my back teeth. I could feel it in the bones of my cheekbones and my jaw and deep inside my skull, behind my eyes. It was a subsonic hum, and it was not coming from my truck. I checked every gauge twice. The engine was running perfectly. There was no unusual vibration in the steering wheel, no shimmy in the chassis, no resonance in the trailer. Whatever was producing that low and bone-deep hum was outside the truck. It was in the air itself. I looked out the windshield. The desert was still there. The moon was still there. The road was still there. But the quality of the landscape had changed in a way that I am not sure how to articulate. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. The sagebrush, which had been individual dark shapes in the moonlight, had merged into a single, featureless dark mass on either side of the road, as if the space between the clumps of vegetation had simply stopped existing. It felt, and I know how this sounds, it felt like I was driving through a tunnel, a long, dark, enclosed space, not the open desert I had been in 5 minutes earlier. The sky above was still there, but it felt closer, more present. The feeling of being watched arrived then, not gradually, all at once. Every trucker knows the feeling I am talking about. The road at night does things to your sense of being observed. There is something about the darkness pressing against the windows and the sense of movement and exposure that can trigger a primal awareness, a feeling of eyes on you from the dark that is usually traceable to nothing more threatening than an overactive amygdala and too many miles without human company. I have felt it dozens of times, and I have always been able to dismiss it within a minute or two. This was not that. This was a feeling of being watched by something specific, something that knew exactly where I was, something in every direction simultaneously. Not one pair of eyes from the darkness, but a comprehensive and total surveillance. The feeling of being under observation by something that did not need to stand in any particular location to see me. It had weight and intention. It was not the generalized unease of a tired mind on a dark road. It was a message, and the message was, "We see you." I picked up my coffee thermos with a hand that was not quite steady, and I took a long drink, and I said out loud to myself, to the empty cab, I said, "You're just tired, Frank. Too many miles, not enough real sleep. That's all this is." But I knew it was not true when I said it. I was not tired. I was frighteningly awake. Every nerve I had was firing. My body had made a threat assessment and returned a verdict of high alert, and my body was not wrong. Something was happening. The subsonic hum intensified, and then the pressure in my ears changed. Not a gradual change. A sudden shift, as if the air pressure in the cab had dropped sharply, the way it does when you descend altitude quickly in an airplane, that feeling of the world pushing inward against your eardrums from outside. I swallowed. It did not equalize. And that was when I saw the light. It was not a car. I knew that before I consciously processed anything about it, because a car would have been coming toward me from the opposite direction, and this light was not moving. It was stationary. A single point of brilliant white light, perfectly still, hovering above the highway directly ahead of me. It was approximately 100 feet above the road surface, maybe a little more, and it was perhaps half a mile away from my position. It did not flicker. It did not pulse or wobble or drift. It simply was. A perfect, motionless, intensely white point of light floating in the air over the center line of a highway in the middle of a Utah desert at 10:15 at night. My first rational thought was helicopter. Law enforcement, maybe. Medical transport. Some kind of emergency response. But there was no sound of rotors. The subsonic hum was still present, deep in my skull, but that was not the sound of a helicopter. A helicopter 100 feet above your position on an empty night road is not something you can miss with your ears. This was silence. The light above the road existed in complete acoustic silence. My second rational thought was drone. Military drone, maybe, given how much military airspace there is in the empty West. But this light was not behaving like any drone I had seen before or since. It was too large, too perfectly spherical, too absolutely still. And it was not at drone altitude. It was at the altitude of a billboard, right there, right in front of me. I kept driving toward it at 65 miles per hour. I did not slow down. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe I was in some kind of mild shock already, and my foot had forgotten what it was supposed to be doing. Maybe the trucker's deep instinct to keep moving overrode the more rational instruction to stop and evaluate the situation from a safe distance. But I kept my speed, and I watched the light get larger as the distance between us closed. At about a quarter mile, I could see it was not a point of light, but a sphere. A perfect sphere, maybe the diameter of a compact car, composed entirely of a white light so intense it should have been blinding but wasn't. It was bright in the way that very clean things are bright. Sterile, pristine. It had the quality of light you see in an operating theater or a clean room, light that has no warmth in it at all. And it was contained. The light did not beam or radiate outward. There were no rays, no glow spreading into the surrounding air. The desert below and around the sphere was bathed only in moonlight. The sphere's light stayed inside the sphere, as if whatever was generating it could only fill the interior of a perfect ball and nothing beyond. I reached for the CB radio with a hand that was trembling badly enough that I missed the switch twice before I caught it. I clicked on and grabbed the mic. "Breaker 19, this is Roadhog." My own voice came back to me from the speaker sounding like someone else's voice, tight and strange and slightly too high. I'm on Route 50 eastbound in Utah, somewhere between the Nevada line and Delta. I've got a visual on something I cannot identify. A sphere of white light approximately 100 feet above the road surface. Stationary. Does anyone copy? Anyone on this channel? The CB exploded with the same static that had taken over the radio, louder than before. It came out of the speaker like something had been waiting for me to open the channel and had poured itself through the moment I did. I pulled the mic away from my ear. The feedback was sharp and physical, a needle of sound going directly into the bone behind my ear. I clicked the mic again, my hand barely cooperating. Hello, anyone on Route 50? Anyone copy? I've got a situation here. Over. Nothing but static. Aggressive, layered, intentional static. I was now perhaps 300 yards from the light. It was directly ahead of me, directly over the center line, hanging in the air with a stillness that felt less like hovering and more like existing. Like it had always been there, and I had just driven close enough to see it. I had a choice to make. I could stop, pull onto the shoulder, kill the engine, sit in the cab and wait for something to happen or not happen, and let whatever this was resolve itself on its own terms. Or I could keep going, drive under it, keep moving the way truckers are supposed to keep moving. Stopping felt wrong. Stopping felt like surrender. Stopping felt like admitting that the light had the power to determine whether I moved or stayed, and something in me, the part that had been driving trucks through blizzards and floods and mountain passes for 3 decades, that part would not accept that. I was on a schedule. I had a load to deliver. The hospital in Denver was waiting. I kept my foot on the accelerator. At 100 yards, the light filled my windshield. Not the whole windshield, not yet, but it dominated the upper center of my field of vision, the most intense and perfectly defined object I had ever looked at. It was not beautiful, exactly. It was beyond the category of beautiful. It was simply the most real-looking thing I had ever seen, the way a thing can be so precisely itself that it stops being an object and becomes a fact. At 50 yards, the subsonic hum in my bones reached a pitch that was almost pain. At 20 yards, I passed directly under the sphere, and the world turned off. There is no other way to describe it. The world turned off. The engine stopped. Not died, not sputtered, not failed. Stopped. The way a sound stops when someone switches off a speaker. Instantaneous and total. The vibration of the road through the chassis stopped. The slight tremor in the steering wheel stopped. The hum in my bones and my teeth stopped. The static from the CB stopped. Every sound that had existed in my world disappeared simultaneously, replaced by a silence so complete and so absolute that it had its own quality, its own texture. It was not the silence of a quiet room or a still night. It was the silence of no air, the silence of a vacuum, the silence of space. The light from the sphere came through my windshield and filled the cab entirely. It was not blinding. I did not squint or shield my eyes. It was simply everywhere, a total and complete white that eliminated every shadow and every dark corner and every plane and angle inside the cab, leaving only brightness. I could not see my dashboard. I could not see my hands on the steering wheel. I could not see the passenger seat. There was only the light, clean and sterile and all-encompassing, and inside it, I was less a man in a truck than I was a point of awareness floating in luminescent white nothing. And then the feeling came. Peace, a peace so profound and so complete that it was almost physical, like being lowered very gently into warm water. Every fear that had been building over the past 15 minutes, the unease and the threat assessment, and the trembling hands and the hammering heart, all of it simply evaporated, not suppressed, not overridden. It was gone, as if it had never existed, as if fear itself were a foreign concept, a word I had encountered in a language I did not speak. I felt calm the way only very young children feel calm when they are being held by someone they completely trust, utterly safe, utterly certain that whatever was happening was exactly what was supposed to happen. I had one clear thought in that silence and that light. One crystalline, inexplicable thought that surfaced from some part of my mind I had never accessed before. Oh, this is what it is. I do not know what it meant. I have spent 20 years trying to understand what it meant. I do not know what it referred to. I do not know what category of understanding I was accessing in that moment. But the thought carried with it a sense of recognition so powerful that it felt like the answer to every question I had ever had and never known how to ask. That is the last thing I remember. The jolt that brought me back was violent enough to snap my head forward and then back hard against the headrest. It was the kind of physical impact that leaves you dazed, blinking, trying to reassemble the immediate world from scattered fragments of perception. Sound came back in a roar. The engine was screaming, revving high, the kind of engine noise you hear when something has gone wrong with the transmission and the gears have failed to engage. The tires were squealing against pavement. The CB radio was putting out a high-pitched tone, not static, a sustained single-frequency squeal like an alarm, like a machine in distress. It went into my ears like a spike. I was drenched in sweat. My shirt was soaked through, and so was the back of the seat behind me, and my hands were slick on the steering wheel that I was apparently still holding. My heart was not just elevated, it was hammering against the inside of my chest with the intensity of something that wants very badly to get out. I could feel my own pulse in my temples, in my wrists, in my throat. I was still on the road. The truck was still moving forward. The desert was outside the windows, moonlit and indifferent, and exactly as empty as it had been before. There was no light. I looked in every mirror. In the driver's side, the passenger side, the wide-angle mirrors on both doors. The road behind me stretched back to the horizon in perfect darkness. Whatever the light had been, wherever it had gone, it was not behind me. It was not above me. It was not anywhere I could see. The sky above the road through my windshield was nothing but stars and the indifferent silver face of the moon. I had several seconds of pure animal confusion, the kind that comes before rational thought reasserts itself, where I was operating entirely on instinct. My foot found the brake pedal. The truck slowed. I guided it toward the shoulder by muscle memory because my vision was not entirely reliable in that moment. The tires crunched on gravel, and I brought the rig to a stop and sat there in the idling cab, breathing in ragged, inadequate gulps. The first rational thing I did was look at the clock on the dashboard. I stared at it for a long time, the way you stare at a word that you know, but that has temporarily lost all meaning. 1:48 a.m. I looked at my wristwatch, my old Timex, the one I had worn since 1989. The face read 1:48 in the morning. The last time I had looked at the clock before I saw the light, before everything had changed, it had been approximately 10:15 p.m. 3 hours and 33 minutes. I grabbed my logbook from the passenger seat with shaking hands and flipped to my last entry, 9 p.m. I had recorded my position and mileage at 9 p.m. as regulations require. I looked out the passenger window for a mileage marker. The small green sign that appeared in my headlights confirmed my position. I was nearly 200 miles beyond where I should have been. The fuel gauge confirmed it. The tank had dropped by an amount consistent with driving 200 miles, not with sitting stationary for 3.5 hours. My body had driven 200 miles. I had not been present for any of it. If you want to understand what that sentence means, if you want to truly feel the weight of it, I want you to think about what it takes to drive a loaded semi-truck 200 miles down a 2-lane highway in the middle of the night. It is not a passive activity. You are making hundreds of corrections per minute, reading the road ahead, responding to minor variations in surface and grade and curve. You are managing a complex machine through a complex physical environment. It requires continuous conscious engagement with the physical world. It is not something that happens to an unconscious person. It is not something that happens to someone who is not there. And I was not there. Whatever I was during those 3.5 hours, it was not present behind the wheel of that truck on that road. And yet the truck had kept moving. The truck had navigated 200 miles of desert highway without drifting off the road or running a stop sign or crossing the center line. 200 miles of perfect driving by a body whose occupant had been removed. I pulled the truck fully onto the shoulder and killed the engine. The silence that followed was profound, but different from the silence I had experienced under the light. This was just quiet, the ordinary quiet of a desert night, which is not entirely silent because the desert is never entirely silent. There was a faint wind that moved through the sagebrush with a dry whisper. Somewhere at a distance, something moved in the landscape, a small animal, a lizard, something alive and close to the ground. The sky was full of stars in a way that city people never see stars. The Milky Way was a river of dim light arching from horizon to horizon. I got out of the cab. My legs were not reliable, and I held the door frame until I was confident they would carry me. The night air was cold and dry, and it hit my sweat-soaked shirt immediately, raising goosebumps along both arms. I walked slowly around the truck, one hand trailing along the cool metal of the cab and the trailer as I went. I was looking for something. Anything. A mark, a scratch, a burn, a scorch. Any physical evidence that something had made contact with my vehicle. A sign that the event had left a physical record, somewhere I could point to. The truck was dusty from the road. It was exactly as dusty as it should have been for the mileage I had covered. The dust was evenly distributed in the way that road dust distributes itself over hours of driving. There were no marks that did not belong there. No burns. No scratches of unusual origin. No sign that anything had ever been different about this truck or this night. There was nothing. I stood there by the side of that highway for a long time, longer than I can accurately account for. I stood there with the cold desert air on my face and the stars overhead in their impossible abundance and the emptiness of the road in both directions, and I felt something I had not felt since I was a very small child. I felt the size of the universe, not as an abstract concept, as a physical reality. The sheer incomprehensible immensity of space and the vanishing smallness of one man standing beside his truck on a 2-lane road in Utah at 2 in the morning. And within that immensity, the presence of something that had just demonstrated, without drama or announcement, that the rules I had always lived by were not the only rules there were. That there were other rules, rules I did not know, rules that applied to me without my consent and without my knowledge, rules that could take 3.5 hours of my life and 200 miles of my road and leave me with nothing where those things had been. I got back in the truck. I sat there for another long while before I started the engine. When I finally did, it turned over without complaint, clean and normal and utterly indifferent to everything that had happened. I drove to Denver. I did not turn the radio on. I did not try the CB. I stopped only for fuel, paid at the pump and got back on the road. I delivered the medical equipment to the hospital loading dock. I was early, not by a little, by a meaningful margin. The dock supervisor made a joke about a trucker finally showing up ahead of schedule. I smiled at him. I had nothing else to offer. My dispatcher called that afternoon. A good run, he said. Clean time. He said something about a tailwind and laughed. I said yes, tailwind, that must have been it. I hung up the phone and sat in my sleeper cab in the hospital parking lot in Denver and stared at nothing for a very long time. If you have gotten this far in my story, you are probably waiting for the explanation. The rational, sensible, reassuring accounting of what happened that makes it possible to file the whole thing away and move on. I do not have one. I have spent 20 years looking for one, and I do not have it. I've considered every explanation that a rational person considers. Microsleep is the first one. The idea that I fell asleep at the wheel, experienced a vivid hypnagogic hallucination of the static and the hum and the light, and then drove 200 miles in a state of unconscious automatism. The problem with this explanation is physics. A loaded semi-truck, driven by an unconscious person on a winding two-lane desert highway for 200 miles, does not arrive safely at the other end. It goes off the road, within the first mile, and I had been entirely awake up to the moment I passed under the light, wide awake, alert, adrenaline flooded, every sense engaged. You do not fall asleep in that state. I have considered a seizure, a temporal lobe event that produced the visual and auditory hallucinations and then wiped my memory. But temporal lobe seizures do not drive trucks. The kind of seizure that produces that kind of memory loss produces corresponding physical incapacity. You do not have a seizure that erases your memory and still navigate a complex vehicle for 3 hours and 33 minutes with no incident. I have read the accounts of other people who have had similar experiences, not just truckers, civilians, people with no particular reason to be on deserted roads late at night, who have nonetheless found themselves with missing time associated with unexplained lights. The details that repeat themselves across accounts from people who have never met each other, never communicated with each other, never had any opportunity to contaminate each other's stories. Those repeated details are the thing that stays with me. The static, the subsonic hum, the feeling of being watched, the sphere or oval of contained white light, the sudden and profound peace, the violent return, the physical exhaustion afterward. The missing miles and the missing hours confirmed by fuel gauges and mileage markers and clocks that do not lie. I do not know what happened to me on Route 50 in Utah. I do not know where I was for 3.5 hours, or who, or what agency of the universe put me back in my truck and pointed me toward Denver. I do not know what was behind the white light, or inside it, or powering it. I do not know what, oh, this is what it is, meant, or what understanding I briefly touched before it was taken away. What I know is this. 3.5 hours of my life do not exist. They are gone. Not forgotten, the way you forget a dream or a forgettable meal. Gone. A hole. Before the light and after the light, with nothing in the middle but a jolt and a scream of engine and a clock that told me I had lost the dark heart of a night on the loneliest road in America. I still drive, or I did until I retired 4 years ago. I never drove Route 50 again. I have driven near it, on parallel roads, and I have felt the pull of it the way you feel the pull of a scar when the weather changes. I do not stop. I do not get close. Occasionally, on long dark stretches of highway, late at night, I still feel that subsonic hum in my back teeth. It comes and goes like a tide. I have no explanation for it. I do not think about what it means for very long. Part of me already knows. Before we continue to our second story, if these trucker accounts are keeping you awake tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. Make sure you are subscribed to Creepyverse so you never miss a night like this one. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling us which detail from Frank's story got under your skin the most, and let's go deeper into the dark. Because the next story does not come from the desert. It comes from the mountains. And the mountains have been watching a very long time. Story 2. The Thing in the Fog. As told by Samuel Grizzly Jones, age 67, long-haul trucker. My name is Samuel Jones, but I have not gone by Samuel since the Nixon administration. On the CB radio, and at every truck stop and loading dock in a six-state region of the Appalachian South, I am Grizzly. I earned that name because I am a big man, 6'4" in my boots, with shoulders wide enough to block a doorway and hands that can cover most of a steering wheel in one palm. I have had a beard since I was 19 years old, and it has never been shorter than 3 inches. At the time of the night I am going to tell you about, it came down to my collarbone and was the color of iron filings in old snow. I have been hauling through the Appalachian Mountains for 40 years. Timber, coal, building materials, general freight. The roads I drive are not the roads they show in trucking commercials. They are not the wide, flat interstates of the American imagination, where a rig can cruise at highway speed with cruise control engaged and a cup of coffee on the dash. The roads I drive are 2-lane mountain roads with grades that will kill your brakes if you do not respect them, and switchbacks tight enough that you have to think about your swing radius going into every curve and drop-offs on one side or the other that go down 100 feet, 200 feet, into wooded valley floors where the creek at the bottom has been running cold and dark since before any road existed. These are old roads. Some of them follow lines that were originally deer paths and then Indian trails and then colonial-era wagon routes before anyone thought to pave them. They have a history that goes back a very long way, and the land they cross has a history that goes back farther than that. I grew up in eastern Kentucky, in a hollow outside of Pikeville where the hills are close, and the sky is a narrow strip of light between the ridgelines. My grandmother was a woman of the mountains in the full sense, meaning she knew the land the way a doctor knows anatomy. She knew which plants healed and which ones harmed. She knew the weather by the way the air smelled before a storm. And she knew the old stories the way other people know their own family histories. She told them to me from the time I was old enough to sit still and listen. She told me about the hints, which is the old mountain word for haints, for ghosts, for the presences that move along the old roads after dark. She told me about the things that live in the deep hollows where the fog settles and the sunlight never fully reaches. Things she would not name directly, but referred to only by implication, by the way she dropped her voice and looked at the fire when she came close to them in a story. She told me that the mountains were alive in a way that the modern world did not like to acknowledge, that there were parts of the hills that had been claimed by something that did not have a human name and did not operate by human rules. I listened to all of it as a child, and I believe I absorbed it the way children absorb things, deeply and without skepticism, and without the rational filter that adult experience installs. But by the time I was driving trucks, by the time I was a big practical man with calluses on my hands and a logbook to maintain and a mortgage to pay, I had done what adults do with the stories of their grandmothers. I had filed them under folklore, under the charming superstitions of a less educated era, under the category of things that matter to people who have not yet learned how the world actually works. I was wrong about that. I have known I was wrong about that since February of 1998. My grandmother tried to tell me. She has been dead for 11 years. I think about her every time the fog starts to come down off the hills. The night in question was in late February of 1998. The specific date I know from my logbook, which I still have, which I have never thrown away because the physical record of that night is the only thing I own that proves it was real. I was running empty, a deadhead in the trade. I had delivered a load of lumber to a job site in Southwest Virginia, and I was heading north on Route 23 back to my home base near Pikeville, Kentucky. Deadheading is a particular state of trucking existence. An empty trailer behind you is a different animal from a loaded one. The whole physics of the rig changes. Empty, the trailer is light and reactive. It wants to move in ways that a loaded trailer does not. In adverse road conditions, rain or ice, or the kind of greasy cold mist surface that Appalachian roads get in late winter, An empty trailer behind you requires a different quality of attention. You are lighter on your feet, as it were, more cautious, more ready. The temperature that night was in the upper 30s, cold enough to be miserable, but not cold enough for ice, which meant the road surface had that particular Appalachian winter quality, a thin film of moisture from the condensation coming off the hillsides, not quite wet and not quite dry, the kind of surface that veteran mountain drivers describe as greasy. It requires respect, and it gets respect from drivers who know what they are doing. I knew what I was doing. I had been driving these specific roads for over 20 years at that point. I knew where the grades steepened and where the shoulder disappeared and where the road curved just enough to surprise you if your speed was a fraction high. I knew Route 23 the way I knew my own neighborhood. I had driven it in every condition that Appalachian weather could manufacture. I had not driven it in what I encountered that night. The fog began before midnight. I noticed it first in the low places, the hollows where the road dips between ridgelines and the cold air collects. The headlights would catch the edge of it, a soft grey density in the air that resolved itself as I got closer into the classic ground fog of the mountains, rolling slowly down the hillsides and pooling in the depressions. This was normal. I reduced my speed appropriately, 20% below the posted limit in foggy conditions. That was my rule, had been my rule for years. I gripped the wheel a little tighter and let my eyes sweep the edges of the road with a little more regularity. But this fog was not behaving quite the way fog behaves. Fog rolls, it moves, it has currents in it caused by the slight temperature differentials in the air, the way a hillside is cooler than the valley floor, the way the air above a creek bed is different from the air above the road. Fog has internal motion even when it looks still. You can see it if you watch it against a light source. It rotates and coils. It is alive in the meteorological sense. It is in motion. It is being driven by forces. This fog was not moving. It was settling. It was not rolling off the hills so much as being deposited, the way paint is rolled onto a surface. A uniform, deliberate covering. Each hollow I passed through was fuller than the last, the fog thicker, the visibility shorter. By the time I reached the section locals call the Serpent's Spine, I was down to about 60 feet of visible road ahead of me. The Serpent's Spine is not an official designation. You will not find it on any map. It is the name that truckers and locals use for a particular 3-mile section of Route 23 in eastern Kentucky that runs along a ridge with a weeping rock cliff on the left, wet and black and streaming with groundwater, and a sheer drop on the right, 200 feet down through dark timber to a creek that is nothing but sound from up on the road. The drop-off side has a guardrail in the nominal sense. A concrete barrier from the 1950s that is more symbolic than structural. It would stop a bicycle with some confidence. It would not stop anything I was driving. I had driven the Serpent's Spine in fog before. I did not love it, but I could do it. You go slow. You hug the left side. You watch the rock face on your left as a reference point. You do not look at the right side. You do not think about the right side. You move forward slowly and precisely, and you come out the other end. What I could not account for was the fog becoming absolute. There is a difference between fog that reduces your visibility to 60 feet and fog that eliminates your visibility entirely. The difference is not a matter of degree. It is a categorical difference. I have been in soup fog, pea soup fog, fog so thick that other drivers stop and put on their hazards and refuse to go further. I have driven through all of it. I have never been in fog that was indistinguishable from being inside a white room. A sealed, opaque, featureless white space with no up and no down, and no forward, and no reference point of any kind. That is what the fog on the Serpent's Spine became that night. Not gradually, not as a slow thickening. It became absolute the way a door closes. I went from 60 feet of visibility to zero in the space of about 30 feet of road distance. One moment, I had the rock wall on my left and the white center line beneath my driver's side front wheel, and the vague dark shapes of the trees on the drop-off side disappearing into white. And then I had nothing. White in every direction. White that was not transparent at all. White that was a solid surface, as if someone had replaced my windshield with a piece of white cardboard while I was driving. I could not see the center line. I could not see the cliff face 6 feet to my left. I could not see the edge of the road that was all that stood between my right front tire and 200 feet of empty air. I could not see the chrome bulldog ornament on my Mac's hood, and that ornament was 4 feet in front of me. I slowed to a crawl, 5 miles an hour, maybe less. My knuckles were white on the wheel. My jaw was clenched hard enough to ache. Every piece of experience I had accumulated in 40 years of mountain driving had reduced itself to a single instruction. Do not stop on the spine. Whatever you do, do not stop on the spine. I crept forward, absolutely blind, listening to the sounds of my truck for any indication that the terrain was changing. Listening for the sound of water, which would tell me I was drifting toward the rock face and the ground springs. Listening for a change in the road surface. Feeling the slight tilt of the cab for any indication that the road was banking one way or another. I was operating entirely by feel and instinct and the accumulated knowledge of 40 years of these specific roads. I was doing everything right. I was using everything I had. And then the engine stopped. The silence was so absolute that for a full second I could not process it. The engine of my Mack truck, a Cummins diesel that had never failed to start on the first turn in 10 years, simply stopped. Not a stutter, not a cough, not the progressive winding down of a machine losing power. It stopped the way a clock stops when you remove the battery. Instantaneous. Total. And with it, everything else stopped. The dashboard lights died. Not dimmed. Died. The green glow of my instruments, the amber warning lights, the backlight on my clock, all of it vanished simultaneously, leaving me in a darkness that was not quite total because the fog outside the windows was emitting its own light. That is the thing I want you to understand about that fog. It was self-luminous. It had a glow to it, faint and cold and utterly sourceless. Not the reflection of any light I was generating, because I was generating no light. My headlights were dead. My running lights were dead. Every electrical system in the truck had ceased to function at the precise moment the engine stopped. The fog was glowing from within itself, a pale, cold, bluish-white luminescence that pressed against every window of my cab like something that wanted to come in. I had been at a near stop when the engine died, which meant I was not in immediate danger of rolling off anything. I put the truck in neutral and set the parking brake. My hands moved through these operations by reflex. My brain was somewhere else, processing the information of total sensory isolation on a cliff road with no power and no visibility. I turned the key. Nothing, not a click. Not the grunt of a starter motor engaging. Not even the faint mechanical sound of something trying to happen. The ignition circuit was dead. I pumped the clutch, jiggled the key, tried twice more. Dead. I reached up and flicked the switch for the overhead light. Nothing. I tried the radio. Nothing. The CB. Nothing. The horn. I pressed the horn button and heard nothing and felt nothing. No vibration. No electrical engagement of any kind. The truck was not a truck anymore. It was a room, an enclosed metal room sitting on a cliff road in absolute fog. The battery was a brand new die-hard, heavy-duty, installed by my own hands 7 days prior. I had tested it after installation. It was the best battery money could buy for a commercial truck application. There was no reason in the world for it to be dead. There was no scenario in the known world of mechanics and electrical systems where every circuit in a vehicle fails simultaneously with no prior warning and no identifiable cause. I sat in the dark and the silence and felt the cold beginning to come in through the thin metal of the cab. My breath was fogging. I could see it in the cold blue glow that pressed against the windows, the only indication that I was still alive and present in a world that had otherwise ceased to function. The silence of the mountains at night, under normal circumstances, is not true silence. The mountains breathe. There is always wind somewhere, even if it is high on the ridge and distant. There are always birds, the whippoorwill in particular, whose call carries extraordinary distances on still nights. There is always water. The mountains are full of water, moving water, seeping and dripping and running along every surface and through every crack in the rock. You do not notice it when everything else is working and the radio is on and the engine is running. But in silence, it is always there. The voice of the mountains, my grandmother would have said, proof that the land is alive. That night there was nothing, not a bird, not a wind, not a drop of water over a stone. A dead, flat silence that felt mechanical, felt constructed, felt like a silence that had been deliberately installed around my truck, rather than something that had descended naturally from a change in weather conditions. It was the silence that told me, before the tapping started, that something was wrong in a way that went beyond mechanical failure and atmospheric weirdness. The silence was wrong. The silence was not natural. The silence was the sound of something holding its breath. I had been sitting in the dead truck for somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes when it started. I cannot be more precise than that because my sense of time had been distorted by the sensory deprivation of total darkness and total silence. Time moves differently when the brain has nothing to anchor it. I had tried everything I could think of to get power back in the truck. I had disconnected and reconnected the battery cables by feel in the darkness. I had checked every fuse I could access without light, running my fingers over the fuse box like a blind man reading Braille. I had tried the ignition again 6 or 7 times. I had been systematically working through every possible mechanical explanation for a total electrical failure when the sound started, and the sound stopped every thought I had immediately. Tab, tab, tab. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate, 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again. On the passenger window. The passenger side of my cab. The door beside the empty seat. The window that faced the drop-off side of the road. The window 3 feet from the edge of a 200-foot cliff. My blood, the blood of a man who has faced real physical danger more times than he can count without anything that could be called fear. That blood did something it had never done before. It felt like it turned cold, not metaphorically cold. I felt a temperature drop in my circulatory system, a physiological response to threat that I had read about but never experienced, every blood vessel in my extremities constricting to protect the core. My hands on the steering wheel became cold. My feet became cold. The heat of my body retreated to my chest and my gut and my head. I turned very slowly toward the passenger window. The fog against the glass was the same cold blue-white luminescence, featureless, opaque, a surface, not a vapor. 3 more taps, patient, unhurried, the rhythm of something that was not in a hurry because it did not need to be in a hurry. My first conscious thought was branch, a branch blown against the window by a wind I could not feel or hear, but there was no wind. There had been no wind since the fog had become absolute, and the tapping had the cadence of intention, not the random, irregular contact of an object moved by air. It had the timing of a knock, someone knocking on a door. Someone or something. Tab, tab, tab. I was not breathing. I realized this. I had stopped breathing at the first tap, and I had not resumed. I forced myself to draw air in slowly, quietly, as if any sound I made would confirm my presence to whatever was outside. as if silence on my part might convince it to move on. The tapping stopped. The silence rushed back in, and it was somehow worse. The pause between action and whatever came next, the held breath of the universe. And then I saw it. A handprint was forming on the outside of the passenger window. I want to be exact about what I mean when I say forming. It was not as though a hand had been pressed against the glass and left a print, the way a child's hand leaves a foggy impression on a cold window. It was not a sudden appearance. It was a slow emergence, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom chemical bath, the image growing from nothing, detail resolving from the pale luminescent background. And the detail, dear God, the detail. It was a hand, but it was wrong. The proportions were not the proportions of a human hand, though they were close enough that the wrongness took a moment to identify. The fingers were too long. Each finger appeared to be approximately half again the length that human anatomy allows, thin and tapering, and slightly curved at the tips, where the nails were visible as dark points. The palm was longer than a human palm relative to the fingers, or the fingers were proportionally too long. I cannot sort out which. It was a hand that belonged to a hand shape that had been slightly modified in a way that broke the human template just enough to register as deeply wrong, without being obviously inhuman at first glance. The print was dark, not the transparent impression of a warm hand on cold glass. This was dark the way oil is dark, a dark, greasy residue with the color of something organic and old. And it was forming from the outside in, the way I said, the detail of the print emerging from the glowing background. I could see the whirls of fingerprints. I could see the lines across the palm, the creases at the joints. I could see the way the skin texture differed between the palm and the pads of the fingers. It was a detailed anatomical record of a hand that should not exist. I made a sound. I cannot dignify it by calling it anything in particular. It was a sound that came out of me involuntarily, the kind of vocalization that the human body produces when the brain encounters something that so thoroughly violates expectation that language has not yet been invented to deal with it. A choked, strangled exhalation of pure animal alarm. It was swallowed immediately by the dead air of the cab. I had pressed myself against the driver's side door without consciously deciding to do so. My back was against the cold metal, and my eyes were locked on the passenger window, and I was as far from that handprint as the interior dimensions of the cab allowed, which was not very far. The print remained on the glass, clear and dark and impossibly detailed. A calling card, a declaration, an act of communication that communicated only its own inexplicability. And then it began to fade. Not disappear suddenly. Fade. The way it had formed in reverse, the detail retreating back into the luminescent background, the dark print thinning and lightening until there was nothing on the window that was not the uniform glow of the fog beyond it. Gone. And in the moment it was gone, the truck came back. Every system simultaneously. The engine did not start, it ignited, the full violence of a cold diesel engine being thrown from complete inactivity to full operation in an instant, a sound I can only compare to a detonation, contained and purposeful, a mechanical explosion. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, every gauge spiking and then settling. The headlights blazed on, cutting into the fog. The radio screamed on at full volume, tuned to a station of pure static and high-pitched interference that were so loud and so sudden and so physically shocking that I screamed. A real, unguarded, primal scream that I am not ashamed to tell you about, because there is no human being alive who would not have screamed in that moment. And then the fog was gone. Not thinning, not rolling back. Gone. Between one heartbeat and the next, the impenetrable white wall that had surrounded my truck ceased to exist. The sky was there. The mountain sky, black and clear and studded with stars so sharp and cold they looked like they had been cut into the darkness with a knife. The moon was almost full, pouring silver light over the valley below me, revealing the trees, the creek, every feature of the landscape that had been invisible for the past hour. The rock face on my left, wet and dark and solid. The road ahead, clear and empty. I could see the chrome bulldog on my hood. The passenger window was clean. No print, no smudge, no oily residue, no trace of anything that had been pressed against it. Clean glass, the kind of clean that comes from something that was never dirty. I got off the Serpent's Spine the way a man moves through a location where he believes he has just survived something fatal, with speed and without looking back. I will not tell you about the drive home in any detail because the drive home is not part of the story. It happened. I was not in it in any meaningful way. I drove with my eyes on the road and my mind somewhere else entirely, cycling through what had happened with the obsessive repetition of a brain that cannot process an event and cannot stop trying to. I pulled into my own driveway in Pikeville at 4:15 in the morning. I looked at the clock on my dashboard and then at my Timex, and then I sat very still for a long time. It was just after midnight when my engine had died on the spine. My perception of the events in the dead truck, the waiting and the tapping and the handprint and the return, that entire sequence felt to me like it had lasted perhaps 30 or 40 minutes. My memory was continuous. There was no gap in it, no sense of elapsed time beyond what I had experienced. From my perspective, my subjective experience of the night, I had been on the spine for less than an hour. But the clock said it was 4:15. 3 hours and more of my life had passed on a cliff road in eastern Kentucky while I sat in a dead truck watching a handprint form on my window. 3 hours of calendar time. 3 hours during which the earth rotated, the stars moved, the temperature dropped another 2 degrees, the night progressed toward morning. 3 hours that existed in the world but not in me. I checked my fuel gauge. My fuel level was exactly consistent with the distance I had driven. I had not moved. My truck had not moved 1 foot from the position it had been in when the engine died. I had sat, stationary, on the edge of a 200-foot drop in the Appalachian Mountains, in a dead truck in absolute fog, for 4 hours. And I had experienced approximately 40 minutes of it. Where did the other time go? I am not being rhetorical. I am asking the question that I have been asking for 27 years, lying awake at night with my wife breathing quietly beside me and the house settling around me, asking into the dark ceiling above my bed, where did the other time go? I do not have an answer. The closest thing I have to an answer is something my grandmother told me once when I was maybe 8 years old, sitting at her kitchen table on a winter night, while the wind came down off the ridge and the fire in the stove ticked and popped. She was telling me one of the old stories, one of the mountain stories about the deep places, and she paused at one point and looked at me with the directness of someone saying something they want to make sure is understood. There are things in these hills, she said, that have been here since before any of us. They don't want to harm you, they don't want to help you, they just want to see what you are. And if one of them ever looks at you, really looks the way they look, you won't remember it, but the time will be gone, like they drank it. I was 8 years old. I did not understand what she meant. I understand now. I have never told my wife Martha the full story. She knows there was a bad night on the spine. She knows the fog was terrible and I had to pull over and I dozed off for a while. She accepted that explanation because she is a practical woman and it is a practical explanation, and she had no reason to look for another one. How do I tell her the rest of it? How do I sit across a dinner table from the woman who has been my partner for 34 years and tell her that something was outside my truck on a cliff road in the mountains at 2 in the morning? Something that knocked on my window with 2 long fingers and pressed its hand against the glass and left a print in something dark and old and impossible to categorize. Something that took 4 hours from my life and gave me back 40 minutes of them and kept the rest. How do I explain the cold spot in my soul that has been there since that night? The place inside me that will not warm up no matter what. The particular quality of wrongness I carry around now. A wrongness that is not misery or trauma in any clinical sense, but is more like a permanent awareness that the world has a layer beneath the one I spent my first 50 years in, and that layer is occupied, and the occupants are old in a way that geological time tries to describe and fails, and they are not indifferent in the way that the desert is indifferent. They are interested. They look. They evaluate. And occasionally, when you are small and alone, and the road disappears, and the engine dies, and the only light in the world is the light that should not be light, occasionally they reach out and knock on your window just to show you they can. I still drive the mountains. I have no other trade. But I do not drive at night if I have any choice about it. And I do not drive in fog that rolls in from the hills the way that fog rolled in on the spine that February night. I will pull over at a diner, a rest stop, a gas station, anywhere, and I will sit and drink bad coffee and wait for the fog to lift, and I will not move until it does. My coworkers know about this. They think I am eccentric. They think it is an old man's cautious habit. They are wrong about what it is. It is knowledge, the kind of knowledge that only costs what it costs, and you cannot get a refund once you have paid for it. I know something is in that fog. I do not know its name. I do not know its nature. I do not know what it wanted from my 4 hours, or what it learned from looking at me, or what it found when it pressed its impossible hand against my glass. I know it is real. And I know, with the certainty of a man who has been driving these particular mountains for 40 years, and has felt the difference between what the mountains normally are and what they were that night. I know that it is still out there. In the hollows, in the deep places, in the fog. Waiting. If Grizzly's story gave you chills and you are still with us, I need you to do one thing right now. Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that this is the kind of content you want more of, and it helps Creepyverse reach more listeners who need to hear these stories. And stick around, because the third account is unlike anything you have heard tonight. The first 2 stories feel ancient, feel rooted, feel like they belong to the land they happened on. This next story feels like tomorrow. This next story is about a voice that knew what it was going to do to Carlos Ramirez before it did it, and it told him, in real time, and then it did it anyway. Story 3. The Broadcast. As told by Carlos Ramirez, age 38, long-haul trucker. My name is Carlos Ramirez, and I need to tell you who I am before I tell you what happened to me. Because who I am is relevant to why what happened to me is so thoroughly and completely terrifying. I am a data person. I grew up in East Los Angeles, the son of an electrician and a bookkeeper. My father understood systems. He could trace a fault through a circuit diagram with the same kind of facility that other people read a map. My mother understood numbers. She could look at a column of figures and feel whether they were right or wrong before she verified them. I inherited both abilities, and I added my own. I understand the logic of connected systems, how data moves, how signals propagate, how a network behaves. I am the kind of person who reads technical manuals for entertainment and finds the architecture of a well-designed system genuinely beautiful. I started driving in 2010, and I embraced it differently than the old-timers did. I did not romanticize the loneliness of the road. I managed it. My rig was a Kenworth T680, a state-of-the-art machine. Multi-screen GPS, satellite radio, a phone mount with a signal booster, dash cam, front and rear, electronic logging device, a temperature monitoring system for the reefer trailer. I was not disconnected from the world when I drove. I was networked into it from a rolling command center with a diesel engine. I believed in the predictability of machines. I believed in the clean, unambiguous language of data. A sensor reading is a fact. A GPS coordinate is a fact. A timestamp is a fact. The world that machines describe does not have ambiguity in it, does not have the fog of human perception or the unreliability of memory or the suggestibility of a tired mind at 2 in the morning on a dark road. Machines tell you what is there, what is measurable, what is real. I held this belief with something close to faith. It was not naive. It was the earned conviction of a person who has found that the empirical approach to the world consistently produces results that are more reliable than any alternative. I had never had a reason to question it. That changed in July of 2018 on US Route 95 in Nevada. And the reason it changed is not that I saw something inexplicable or heard something impossible, though I did both of those things. The reason it changed is that the thing that happened to me was itself technological. What I encountered on that road was not ancient or natural or atmospheric. It was engineered. It was designed. It was a system operating with the clean, elegant efficiency of a well-built machine. And it used my own technological context, my own reliance on radio and signal, and the familiar language of transmitted communication against me like a weapon. When something ancient and natural takes 4 hours from you in the fog of an Appalachian mountain road, it is terrifying. When something engineered and deliberate takes 94 minutes from you on a Nevada highway while announcing its intentions in technical language, it is a different category of terrifying entirely. Because the first kind of encounter suggests a universe full of things we do not understand. The second kind suggests a universe full of things that understand us completely and are using that understanding in ways we have no defense against. I prefer Grizzly's experience, and I have never driven Route 23 in my life. The run was Idaho to Las Vegas. Refrigerated produce, a reefer load of fresh vegetables from the agricultural interior of Idaho, headed to the restaurants and hotels and casinos of a city that consumes fresh produce the way it consumes everything else, voraciously and continuously, and without acknowledgement of where it comes from. I had done this run before, southern Idaho to southern Nevada. Long, hot, empty, and straightforward. The heat in Nevada in July is not a weather condition. It is a geological fact. The desert in July sits under a sun that is expressing a kind of hostility toward the surface of the earth. Pavement temperatures can exceed 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Tires that are slightly underinflated and slightly worn and slightly over their load rating will fail in that heat. I was running new rubber, and I was running correctly inflated, and I was running within my load limits, and I was still watching my tire pressure display with the kind of attention you give to a thing that can kill you if you ignore it. I was driving through the night to avoid the worst of it. This is common practice on desert runs in summer. The temperature drops 40 degrees after sunset, and the road surface drops a corresponding amount, and your equipment is simply safer. The Nevada desert at night is its own world. The heat that bakes the air all day releases from the ground after dark, and the air becomes crystalline, dry and cool, and so clear that your headlights seem to reach farther than physics should allow. The stars over the Nevada desert at night are not the diluted, ambiguous stars of a light-polluted sky. They are the original stars. The stars as the sky intended them, so numerous and so sharp that the Milky Way looks like a road you could drive on if you went high enough. I had my satellite radio on, a 90s rock station, one of the preset stations I kept on my receiver. The Smashing Pumpkins and Nirvana and Pearl Jam, familiar and aggressive and well-suited to a long night run. My GPS was tracking progress, the calm synthetic female voice telling me periodically that I should continue straight for another 140 miles, another 120 miles, the monotony of the Nevada desert encoded in distance and time. My reefer was running at temperature. My load was secure and cold. Everything was in its correct state. I was somewhere in the dead center of nothing, in the dark stretch of Route 95 between Tonopah and Beatty, in the landscape of the Nevada test site and the China Lake Naval Air Weapons Station and all the other fenced and signposted pieces of the desert that belong to the government and do not want your attention. The signs out there are not gentle. Restricted area. No trespassing. Use of deadly force authorized. They stand at the fence lines at regular intervals, and they are not theatrical. They mean what they say, and the land behind them looks the same as the land in front of them, flat and sage and distant hills, and yet is somehow different. It has been used for things that the public record does not describe in detail. You drive past those fences at 2 in the morning under that enormous sky, and you can feel the weight of the classified. At approximately 2:03 in the morning, the satellite radio dropped out. The music stopped. The display read, "Acquiring signal." This happens. Remote areas, even in the satellite age, have coverage gaps. I was not concerned. I reached over and switched to FM, intending to find the hiss of an empty dial and then switch to one of my stored playlists. I scanned, hiss on every frequency, the desert's standard FM offering. I started to reach for the input button to switch to stored media, and then I stopped. Because one of those hissing, empty frequencies was not empty. The silence came first. The hiss dropped out the way a signal drops when you land on a clean, strong local frequency, a channel that is being broadcast with enough power to override the background noise of the atmosphere. Silence, the silence of a clear transmission. And then the voice. A man's voice, mid-range, neutral in the way that training makes a voice neutral, the kind of voice that belongs to a person who has practiced removing all personal affect from their vocal delivery. Medical professionals develop this voice. Military personnel develop it. Emergency responders develop it. The voice of a person who is required to communicate information accurately and without emotional contamination, for whom precision is more important than human warmth. This voice was that voice, taken to an extreme. It was so devoid of affect that it did not sound quite human, though it clearly was. It was the voice of a man so thoroughly trained to be a pure transmission mechanism that he had ceased, in some functional sense, to be a person and had become an instrument. He was not talking to me. That was my first and immediate assessment. He was transmitting, the way dispatchers transmit, the way air traffic controllers transmit. He was reporting to someone, or to a recording system, or to a monitor. He was making a record of something that was in progress. Alpha Tango 79er, he said. Subject is compliant. Vitals are nominal. Respiration 14 breaths per minute, consistent with calm wakefulness. Heart rate elevated at 96 beats per minute, which is within the expected range for a subject in an alert driving state. No anomalous stress indicators. Commencing sequence Delta on schedule. I felt the hairs on my forearms stand up. The specific physical sensation of the body registering something that the brain has not yet processed. Something about what this man was saying was wrong in a way I had not yet articulated. I kept listening. My thumb moved away from the input button. Sequence Delta initiated. Auditory component now active. Introducing a low-frequency sine wave at approximately 16 Hz, below normal threshold of conscious human perception. The target shows no behavioral response to the auditory component, which is expected and desired. Neurological effect is confirmed. Activity in the temporal lobe shows the predicted pattern of increase. Subject is entering the receptive state. Proceed to secondary stimulus. Slight distance. The way you watch something in a dream where your agency is present, but attenuated. My hands were still on the wheel. The wheel was still being managed. I was not managing it. Subject is fully receptive, the voice reported. Initiating primary protocol. Memory narrative implant. Parameters as follows. Target emotional profile. Childhood loss, specifically an incident of irreversible small loss type that produces a sustained sense of regret without traumatic classification. Design is for elevated emotional response with tear production, but without panic-inducing content. The narrative will be introduced over the next 4 to 5 minutes. Subject will experience the content as genuine autobiographical memory. Response assessment will follow. What happened next is the most disturbing thing in this entire account. More disturbing than the missing time. More disturbing than driving a truck with nobody home at the wheel. More disturbing even than the clinical precision with which the entire event was being conducted and recorded. What happened next was that I was given a memory. Not shown a memory, given one. Installed in my working memory with such fidelity, such completeness, such sensory richness, that it was indistinguishable from an actual autobiographical recollection. Not a dream, not a vision, a memory. The kind of memory that carries in it the specific, incommunicable quality of something you actually lived. I was 7 years old. I was at a county fair. I know that sounds mundane, and I know that sounds like the beginning of a pleasant childhood anecdote, and I know that nothing about that setup sounds like horror. But I need you to understand the quality of what happened to me before you dismiss it for its apparently soft subject matter. The smells came first. The specific layering of smells that a county fair produces. The sharp sweetness of kettle corn in a hot pan. The chemical sweet of cotton candy on a paper cone. The grease and sugar of funnel cake. The animal smell from the livestock pavilion carried on a hot summer breeze. The diesel exhaust of the tractor pull in the background. I could smell all of these things. Not the memory of smells the way you abstractly recall the category of a scent. The actual olfactory experience. The molecules in my nose, producing the neurological response of smell. I could hear the carousel. An old-fashioned carousel, the mechanical music slightly off-tempo, slightly off-key in the way that aged gears produce, a cheerful broken sound. I could hear the murmur of a crowd, the individual voices lost in the aggregate sound of people in a warm and pleasant outdoor space on a summer afternoon. I could feel the heat of the sun on the back of my neck, my 7-year-old neck. My smaller, younger body, the dimensions of childhood restored to me with complete accuracy. The way the world looks when you are 4 feet tall and everything around you is proportionally larger than it will ever be again. I was holding a balloon, a red balloon. The string was a thin white ribbon, the kind they use for helium balloons at every fair and birthday party and celebration in the world, and the feel of it in my small hand was completely specific. The slight resistance as the balloon pulled upward, the thinness of the ribbon between my fingers, so thin that I had to concentrate to hold it. The way the balloon bobbed and pulled and wanted to go up. And then it went up. The string slipped through my fingers. Whether I released it or it was taken from me by a gust of wind, I cannot say. In the memory there is no wind. The world is still and warm. The string simply slid out of my hand the way something slides when you are not paying close enough attention to it, and the balloon went up. It went up and I watched it go. Red against blue sky. Getting smaller with distance, slower than you would think. The air above the fair still enough that the balloon rose without drifting much. Just up, directly up. The red dot of it diminishing against the blue until it was too small to see clearly. And then smaller, and then nothing. Gone. And the sadness that came with its disappearance was enormous. It was not the sadness of a child who has lost a small thing. It was the sadness of irreversibility. The specific grief of watching something go in a direction you cannot follow, the understanding that some losses cannot be corrected, that some moments of inattention produce permanent subtractions from the world. The feeling was so real and so present that it was suffocating, and I could feel the tears forming before the voice on the radio spoke again. Narrative implant successful. Emotional response confirmed. Saline secretion detected via facial thermal imaging. Tears are confirmed. Amplitude of emotional response is within target parameters. No panic indicators. Proceeding to final phase. My face was wet. I touched my cheek. My fingers came away damp. I was crying. Real tears. Physiologically real tears, from lacrimal glands in eyes in a face that was adult and male and sitting behind the wheel of a truck on a Nevada highway, crying for a childhood memory of a red balloon that had never existed. The memory was not mine. I grew up in East Los Angeles. I grew up in apartment complexes and concrete playgrounds. My parents worked 60 hours a week between them, and county fairs were not a part of my childhood. I have never owned a red balloon. I have never stood in a summer field and watched a balloon rise until it disappeared. That child was not me. That memory did not belong to me. It had been written into me, as precisely and deliberately as a programmer writes code into a machine. And it had made me cry. I still had enough of my awareness available to register what was happening. I was driving a truck. I knew this. I was on a highway in Nevada. I knew this. Something was happening to me that I did not consent to and did not understand, and that had targeted me specifically, had accessed my cognitive function without my knowledge, had planted a false memory with enough fidelity to produce a genuine emotional response. I knew all of this, in the way you know things in a half-dream state when the conscious mind is present, but without power. I knew it, and I could not act on it. My body was performing the correct physical behaviors for operating a truck. My eyes were on the road. My hands were making the small continuous adjustments of highway driving. My right foot was maintaining the accelerator at a consistent pressure. But I was not doing any of this. My body was executing these functions without me. I was watching from inside, a passenger in my own physiology. The voice on the radio delivered its final transmission with the same even, uninflected calm it had maintained throughout. Primary protocol complete. Assessment complete. Initiating the final phase. The erasure protocol consists of a high-frequency auditory pulse, subthreshold, delivered over a period of 11 seconds, followed by pharmacological induction of a 94-minute period of temporal displacement, during which the subject will continue all standard operational behaviors for their current activity. The subject will retain no memory of any portion of the preceding protocol. Upon termination of the displacement period, the subject will perceive a seamless continuity of experience with no subjective sense of gap or interruption. The time differential is calculated to be approximately 94 minutes. Procedure is complete. Broadcast terminating. And then silence. The radio went dead. Not static. Dead. The absolute silence of a frequency that is no longer being used. I blinked. The cab came back into focus around me. The green dashboard glow, the steering wheel in my hands, the highway ahead, straight and dark and familiar, the low rumble of my engine. I felt the way you feel when you wake from a deep sleep in an unfamiliar place. The world is recognizable but not yet fully located. There is a moment of assembling. I looked at the sky in my rear-view mirror. The eastern horizon was a shade that was not quite black, a deepening of dark toward gray, toward the first suggestion of dawn. Early, very early, but no longer fully night. I looked at my dashboard clock. 3:37. The last time I had looked at the clock, just before the satellite radio had dropped out and I had switched to FM, It had been 2:03. I had listened to a broadcast that had felt, in my subjective experience, like 5 or 10 minutes. The voice of the man on the radio, the fade into the memory of the balloon, the return to the cab. 10 minutes, perhaps, 15 at most. The clock said 94 minutes had passed. The time differential will be approximately 94 minutes. He had told me. The voice had announced the precise duration of what was going to happen to my time before it happened. And then it had happened, exactly as stated. I grabbed my phone. 3:37 a.m. I opened my GPS log. Since 2:03 a.m., my truck had traveled over 112 miles at a nearly perfectly consistent highway speed. 112 miles of desert highway, navigated in heavy vehicle at night without incident while I was not present. I pulled over. I put the truck on the shoulder and put it in park and sat there with my hands in my lap and the engine idling, and tried to find something in the inventory of my rational mind that could account for what had just happened. I want to be precise about the nature of what I experienced, because precision matters here, and because I am a precise person, and because the precision is, in some ways, the most disturbing part of the whole account. I did not experience something ancient. I did not encounter something natural, something that predates human history and operates by rules that no human language has ever tried to codify. What I encountered was technical. It was engineered. It was the product of deliberate design and significant technological capability. Someone, or some organization, had built a system capable of the following operations. First, identifying a specific target, a specific individual in a moving vehicle on a public highway in real time, and designating that individual as a subject. Second, delivering precisely calibrated subthreshold auditory and visual stimuli to that individual without their knowledge or consent, producing a specific and desired neurological state. Third, constructing and delivering a complete false autobiographical memory with full sensory fidelity across multiple sensory modalities that the target experiences as genuine, recalled experience. Fourth, removing the target's conscious presence from their own body for 94 minutes, while their body continues to perform a complex and safety-critical operational task. Fifth, returning the target to conscious presence with no subjective sense of gap or discontinuity. Sixth, erasing all memory of the preceding procedure. The erasure failed, at least partially. I remember the broadcast. I remember the voice. I remember the technical language and the specific claims it made. I remember the memory of the red balloon that was not mine. I remember touching my wet face. I do not know why the erasure was incomplete in my case. It may be that I was at the edge of the effective range of whatever technology was deployed. It may be that the specific neurological characteristics of my brain made the procedure less effective than it was designed to be. It may be that the incomplete erasure was itself a test, and that someone is aware I retained this memory and is watching to see what I do with it. That last possibility is the one I try not to think about too often. I tried to find the radio frequency again after I pulled over. I spun the dial from one end of the FM band to the other. Nothing. Clean, empty static. Whatever had been broadcasting on that frequency was gone. No warm-up, no cooldown, no residual signal. Gone the way a signal is gone when the transmitter is switched off and the antenna is taken down and the facility that housed it is closed and locked behind a chain-link fence in the middle of the Nevada desert. I drove the rest of the way to Las Vegas in a state I can only describe as philosophically disrupted. The delivery was on time. I unhooked the reefer at the distribution center, signed the paperwork, got back in my cab. I sat in a truck stop parking lot on the edge of Las Vegas for 3 hours before I could make myself drive back north. I sat with a cup of coffee that went cold and watched the early morning desert light come up over the spring mountains and thought about the nature of consent, about the relationship between a person and their own mind, about the assumption that I had always made, the assumption that everyone makes, that the contents of your own consciousness are yours, that what you think and what you remember and what you experience as real is yours, exclusively yours, as protected from external interference as your body is protected by your skin. That assumption was wrong. Whatever had built the broadcast on the Nevada desert had demonstrated that with clinical efficiency. My consciousness was not a private space. It was a space that, with the right technology and the right access, could be entered and rearranged and exited without leaving a trace that the casual observer would notice. Without leaving a trace that I had noticed, at least not in the way they intended. I carry the memory of the red balloon still. This is the strangest part of the aftermath and the hardest to describe. The memory that was planted in me, the false childhood at the county fair with the balloon that slipped from my fingers, has not degraded the way false memories typically degrade. It has not faded or become obviously artificial in its texture. It is still there, stored in my memory with all the fidelity that a real memory carries. And occasionally, in a quiet moment, in a moment between other moments, I will feel a pang of sadness that I cannot immediately account for, a flash of loss and regret, and I will trace it back to a red balloon rising into a blue summer sky, and I will remember, a half-second later, that it never happened. That grief, that pang of loss for a childhood I did not have, and a balloon that was never real, is the most persistently disturbing element of the entire experience. The missing time I can intellectualize. The body on autopilot I can file under inexplicable and move on. But the emotion, the real, genuine, physiologically produced emotion of loss over a fabricated memory, that is the thing I cannot distance myself from. They did not just take 94 minutes from me. They put something in me, and it is still there. I think about the question I asked myself in that truck stop parking lot while the coffee went cold and Las Vegas hummed in the background doing what Las Vegas always does. The question is simple and the answer is intolerable. Was it the first time? Is the broadcast on the Nevada desert something that had been deployed before? Something that had found me before? Something that had done the complete job on previous occasions, previous hauls through that stretch of Route 95, and I had driven through and never known? Are there other gaps in my life, other 94-minute segments of experience that were replaced with seamless continuity and empty white space, and no alarm signal, no partial erasure failure, nothing to suggest that anything had happened? How many times? I cannot answer this question. I cannot verify it one way or another. I have only the data that remains available to me, and what that data suggests is that on one specific night in July 2018, something that was engineered and sophisticated and capable targeted me specifically, used my own neurological architecture against me with precision and expertise, and took from me a portion of my existence, and told me it was going to do it. And then did it. And almost got away clean. I still drive. It is my trade. It is what I know. It is how I pay my rent and keep my family's lights on. I drive with my state-of-the-art equipment and my multi-screen GPS and my satellite radio and my electronic logging device. I am still, in most senses of the word, a technological man. But I am a different technological man than I was before July of 2018. I do not scan the FM dial in the Nevada desert. This is not superstition. This is not irrational caution. If you encountered what I encountered and retained enough of the experience to know what it was, you would make the same choice. The FM dial in that part of Nevada is not safe. There is something on it. Something that was using it to find me and to find, I suspect, others. I do not know whether it is always there or only periodically. I do not know whether it varies its frequency to avoid accidental detection. I do not know whether it has found me again since and completed the job properly this time, leaving me with no memory and no suspicion and a seamless experience of a drive that was nothing of the sort. That last possibility is the one that keeps me awake. Because here is what I know about a perfect erasure. You cannot know it happened. By definition, a perfect erasure is indistinguishable from nothing. If they completed the procedure correctly on a subsequent occasion, I would have no record of it. My memory would show me a continuous, uninterrupted drive through the Nevada desert with the satellite radio on, and the GPS tracking my progress and no anomalies of any kind. How many times? I carry a second watch now, an analog watch that I keep in my breast pocket against my chest, and I check it against my dashboard clock every 30 minutes on any run that takes me through that part of Nevada. If there is ever a discrepancy, even a small one, even 5 minutes, I will know. So far there has been no discrepancy. But I check anyway, and I keep one hand away from the FM scan button when I am on US Route 95. And I drive with the awareness of a man who knows that the road he is on is not as empty as it appears, that the silence on the dead channel is not absence but anticipation, and that somewhere in the fenced and classified desert, in a facility without a public name, and without a record that I am permitted to access, something that was built by someone is still running, still broadcasting, still scanning the highway for the glow of headlights moving through the dark, still looking for the next subject. I hope it is not you. I hope you are not on US Route 95 at 2 in the morning with your FM dial scanning through the empty frequencies. I hope, if you are, that you keep your thumb off the scan button. And if the hiss ever stops and a voice begins, a calm, neutral, clinical voice speaking in technical language about a subject and a sequence and a protocol, I hope you remember what I told you. Turn it off. Turn it off immediately. And drive. Just drive. And do not stop until the lights of a city are around you and other people are visible and the world feels like it has witnesses in it. Because alone in the Nevada desert at 2 in the morning, with a voice on a dead channel telling you exactly what it is going to do to your mind, you do not have much time before the broadcast tells you that it is ending. And then it takes everything. That is the third story. And if you have been with us for all three, I want you to take a breath right now. A real one. You have earned it. 3 men, 3 roads, 3 encounters with something that should not exist, and yet exists, and yet takes and leaves nothing but the questions that follow you into the next night and the night after that. If these stories kept you awake tonight, if you are going to be checking your mirrors a little more carefully on your next long drive, if you are going to think twice before scanning the FM dial in a dead zone, then Creepyverse did exactly what it was supposed to do. Hit the like button, leave a comment, tell us which of the 3 stories got to you the deepest. Frank Miller's white sphere over the Utah highway, Grizzly's handprint on the glass in the Appalachian fog, or Carlos's voice on the dead channel telling him precisely how it planned to steal 94 minutes of his life. Subscribe to Creepyverse so you are here for the next one, because the road does not stop, the dark does not stop, and the stories that come back from it keep coming. We will be here, in the dark, waiting. This has been Creepyverse. Sleep well if you can.